A duck named Daisy is placed inside a room unlike anything she has ever seen. Every wall covered in jagged foam wedges, no flat surface anywhere. A room specifically engineered to swallow sound completely. Scientists record her quack. Then they move her to a second room, the exact opposite kind of space. Hard walls, bare surfaces, a room built specifically to bounce sound back as violently as possible. They record her again. For decades, a claim had been circulating everywhere. Chain emails, trivia shows, even a British game show built an entire episode around it. A duck's quack doesn't echo, and according to the legend, nobody can explain why. It sounds like the kind of quirky, harmless fact you'd repeat at a dinner party. Except it isn't true. It was never true. And when a team of acoustic scientists finally sat down and tested it directly using specialized equipment most people will never see in their entire lives, what they found explained something far more interesting than the myth itself. Why an idea this wrong managed to survive, unquestioned, for years. Today, we're going inside the real science of why this myth felt true, even though it never was. Before we get to the experiment, you have to understand exactly how strange this claim actually was. An echo is simple physics. Sound travels outward from its source as a wave. When that wave hits a hard, flat surface, some of the energy bounces back. If the delay is long enough, roughly a tenth of a second or more, your ears perceive that reflection as a distinct, separate sound. An echo. This isn't unique to any particular kind of sound. It happens with a shout in a canyon, a clap in an empty room, a dog's bark bouncing off the side of a building. There's no known law of physics that would carve out a special exception for one specific bird species. Sound doesn't check what animal produced it before deciding whether to bounce off a wall. And yet, this specific claim about ducks became widespread enough that people repeated it as established fact, often adding the strange extra detail that made it even more compelling. Not just that it doesn't echo, that nobody could explain why, a genuine, unsolved mystery of acoustics hiding inside something as ordinary as a farmyard bird. That combination, an impossible claim wrapped in scientific mystery, is exactly the kind of story that spreads, which is precisely why, eventually, real scientists decided to settle it for good. In 2003, a research team at the University of Salford's Acoustics Research Center in England decided to test the claim directly. The team was led by Professor Trevor Cox, an acoustic engineer whose actual day-to-day research focused on serious applications, the design of concert halls, recording studios, and buildings where sound quality genuinely matters. Testing a duck myth wasn't his typical project, but the persistence of the claim made it worth actually investigating. They borrowed a duck from a farm. Her name was Daisy. The experiment itself was elegantly simple. First, researchers placed Daisy inside an anechoic chamber, a specialized room built specifically to eliminate echoes entirely. Every wall lined with angled, sound-absorbing foam wedges designed to trap sound waves and prevent almost any reflection at all. This gave them a clean, baseline recording of exactly what Daisy's quack sounded like with no echo whatsoever. Then they moved her to a reverberation chamber, essentially the exact opposite kind of room. Hard, reflective surfaces specifically engineered to bounce sound waves repeatedly, creating pronounced, measurable echoes. They recorded Daisy quacking in both environments, then handed the recordings over to a team of acoustic engineers for detailed analysis. If the myth were true, the two recordings should have looked meaningfully different only in general loudness, with no genuine echo pattern showing up in the reverberant room. The results were unambiguous. When researchers analyzed the recording from the reverberation chamber, the acoustic data clearly showed reflected sound energy. Daisy's quack did echo, measurably, exactly the way basic physics predicted it should. Professor Cox summarized the finding plainly. The sound produced by a duck's quack is, in his words, rather sinister sounding, but it does indeed echo. So if the science was this clear, this straightforward, why had the opposite myth managed to spread so widely in the first place? This is where the study became genuinely interesting, because the researchers didn't just prove the echo existed, they identified exactly why so many people had never noticed it. A duck's quack isn't a short, sharp sound, like a clap or a gunshot, the kind of noise that produces an echo easy for human ears to separate from the original. Instead, a quack has a distinctive gradual decay. That familiar, slightly rough quack trails off slowly, rather than cutting off abruptly. Acoustically, that fading tail sounds remarkably similar to what an echo of the same sound would sound like. When the actual echo does return, milliseconds later, it blends almost seamlessly into the tail end of the original quack. The two sounds essentially collide and merge, becoming acoustically indistinguishable to an untrained human ear. Researchers described it as the echo being effectively swallowed by the quack itself. There was a second factor working against anyone trying to hear this echo in the real world. Ducks aren't typically found quacking next to concrete walls, stone bridges, or hard reflective cliff faces, the kinds of surfaces that produce the clearest, most obvious echoes. Instead, ducks live and vocalize primarily around ponds, marshes, and lake shores, soft mud banks, dense reeds, open water with no vertical reflective surface nearby at all. These environments are naturally poor at producing strong echoes in the first place. Soft, irregular surfaces absorb and scatter sound energy rather than cleanly reflecting it back. The same basic acoustic principle that makes recording studios line their walls with foam paneling. Combine a quack's naturally low volume and gradual decay with an environment poorly suited to reflecting sound clearly, and you get exactly the conditions this myth needed to survive. An echo that technically exists, physically, exactly as predicted by basic acoustics, but one that's genuinely difficult for an average person, standing at a typical pond, to consciously notice or separate from the original sound. Not a violation of physics. A perfect storm of low volume, acoustic masking, and unfavorable surroundings, all working together to hide something that was there the entire time. If this kind of hidden explanation behind an everyday myth is fascinating you as much as it fascinated the researchers, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps stories like this reach more people. Here's what makes this story about more than just one duck experiment. It's also a story about how misinformation survives, even after being conclusively disproven. This particular myth has circulated for decades, through chain emails in the 1990s, viral internet posts, and trivia shows that treated it as an established, quirky fact rather than something worth questioning. Even after Professor Cox's team published their findings in 2003, and after further coverage by fact-checking organizations reaffirming the results, the myth kept resurfacing. New viral posts, new chain messages, the same false claim, presented as though it had never been investigated at all. Researchers studying misinformation point to a pattern that explains why claims like this persist. A statement that sounds surprising but harmless, wrapped in the appearance of scientific mystery, is remarkably resistant to correction. It doesn't threaten anyone's beliefs. It doesn't require taking a side on anything controversial. It's simply fun and strange enough that people want to believe and repeat it, whether or not anyone ever actually checks. The duck echo myth isn't dangerous, but it's a small, low-stakes example of something that plays out constantly across far more consequential topics. A catchy, surprising claim, repeated widely enough, can outlast the actual science correcting it, sometimes for decades. So why does it matter whether a duck's quack technically echoes or not? On its own, honestly, not very much. Nobody's safety depends on knowing the acoustic properties of a mallard's vocalization. But the underlying lesson matters more than the duck does. An idea repeated often enough starts to feel true, regardless of whether anyone has actually tested it. The duck myth persisted specifically because almost nobody who repeated it had ever stood at a pond with a specific intention of listening carefully for an echo. Once actual scientists finally did test it properly using real acoustic instruments in controlled conditions, the answer turned out to be exactly what basic physics predicted all along. Ducks are not exempt from the laws of sound. They never were. What made this myth interesting was never really about the duck. It was about how easily a claim can spread simply because it's strange enough to remember, and ordinary enough that almost nobody bothers to check it for themselves. So the next time you're near a pond and a duck lets out that familiar, slightly rough quack, listen closely. Somewhere in that fading sound, bouncing softly off the water and the reeds around it, an echo is genuinely there. Quiet, overlapping, easy to miss, but there, exactly as the laws of physics always said it should be. Not a mystery science can't explain. A myth that simply never got properly tested until a duck named Daisy and one very curious research team finally put it to rest. If this story changed the way you'll think about the next myth you hear, subscribe to Birdhearts so you never miss the next hidden mystery in the bird world. And tell me in the comments, had you already heard this myth before today? I'll see you in the next one.